This is for you if you are a therapist, coach, or leader who works with humans. You're going to want to understand this and you want to get this. Trauma-informed is not trauma-trained or trauma-focused. Today I'm going to deep dive on what the meaning behind both are and how to know where you sit based on what you've done, and maybe be able to actually screen for which therapist or coach or space holder that you want to work with. So trauma-informed, it's really important that people do trauma-informed training, and I'm not going to knock the idea of it because I think it's in fact very, very important. Trauma-informed training is what you'd hope most people have done when it comes to working with trauma. But it's not all what it's made out to be. I think what a lot of people find themselves in that are working in this field think that it's going to be more than it is. Thinking that it's going to help them be able to work with people's trauma. But it is not enough because it doesn't mean that. I'm going to break down the real understanding between the difference between being trauma trained, trauma focused, and trauma informed. Because when we don't really take this work more seriously, then we're going to end up impacting people, potentially re-traumatizing people, potentially not really getting to the point where we really want to in the work that we do and the people that we want to help and work with. Now, if you aren't a therapist, space holder, or leader, then this is also potentially something that's going to be helpful for you in being able to make the difference between who I might choose to be my next therapist or coach, right? So stay tuned while I deep dive into the reality of what is going on, the truth around what it might be, and what are we going to do next, right? So you've done a lot of trauma-informed training in the past, or you did one that your work provided, or you saw a course online, or maybe you've done one of the really deep and intricate ones that actually go into lots and lots of detail around what it means to be trauma-informed. And this is great. But it isn't maybe the ability to then work with the complexity of someone's trauma. So a trauma-informed training, what we'd hope for is that we're able to give you the language, be able to give you some of the lingo, and be able to give you the principles and framework of what trauma is and means. So it might be the types, it might be the definitions. The principles being safety, trust, the ability to be able to create the space, understanding around what it means to then move with someone who might have trauma. All these things are excellent, right? What it also starts to hopefully inform you of is the nervous system as a whole. The ability to look at what are the resources or signs of someone that might be living with trauma. All that stuff is so, so important. And if you've only done that, then that's better than not doing any work at all. I'm going to tell you a few stories as I explain and dive deeper into what this all means. The first one being probably about 10 years ago, when all this started to become the buzzword, trauma-informed, right, is this training became something that was so essential, because what it was starting to distinguish from is that people have experiences beyond what they might be presenting with. So I've worked in treatment centers of addiction, and at the time they said you can't work with someone who also has mental health issues, and we definitely can't work with someone's trauma. So we just had to work with the alcohol addiction or the drug addiction, which why trauma-informed trainings was so important was the reality that there is no such thing, that we actually need to be informed beyond what might be going on for an individual, be able to understand some of their impact and be aware of what that might look like when it comes to working with the complexity of a human, right? So really valuable at the time. And I guess when Australia got it, it was old. There was already pioneers in the field for the last 60, 70 years talking about trauma and its impact, talking about its correlation between mental health, addiction, and all of the family systems and everything that it comes with. So trauma-informed trainings were incredibly important. Now, anyone and everyone can make their own trauma-informed training and sell it online, which is good and bad. More access to information can be really, really helpful. It means that everyone in the stretch of the internet can potentially expose themselves into the reality of trauma. Now, to go then further and say, because I'm trauma informed, means I can work with people's trauma. That is not trauma informed training. That is not what you get taught there. Because fundamentally, it's about creating awareness. Trauma informed is awareness building around what is trauma. So when someone says trauma informed, that they've done their certificate in trauma informed care, whatever it might be, we're a trauma informed breathwork facilitator, we're a trauma informed yoga instructor. It's just the basics, which means if that's what I'm after from an informed lens, then I'm going to be in some pretty good hands. Now, if I, as a client or someone that wants to participate in this sort of work, is looking through the lens of if they're trauma informed, it means that they can work with my deep trauma. Or if I'm that practitioner doing a trauma informed training, hoping that this means that I've done trauma training and I can now work with trauma, are wildly misinformed. Funny that, right? So trauma focused or trauma trained is the deep work, the actual application and treatment of trauma. Very, very different. What trauma-informed trainings miss is the in-depth analysis of these responses and where they come from, and the nervous system and what that looks like in relationship to someone experiencing trauma. That's what it misses. It also misses the practitioner's nervous system, which is the number one intervention for another person, is my nervous system and it being in a place where I can hold and take on capacity, so that when you're going through your storm or the weather is sort of shifting around in your nervous system, I can meet you in that. I can mirror and join you and find my peace and my balance that will help you move through. So I use my nervous system as that intervention. Trauma-informed training barely scratches the surface on that. What it doesn't meet is then the ability to work with someone's complexity and how to work with it, how to actually respond to the fight, flight, freeze responses live as they happen for someone's experience. I'm going to tell you a few different examples around what that looks like and what does that actually mean, so that you can start to know the difference between this informed versus trained. But first, I've studied for 10 years, right? Across lots of different things. The first thing I did was an undergraduate in psychology. And let me tell you, 3 years of psychology, that word wasn't even mentioned. Now this is 10 years plus ago, more than that, but trauma-informed wasn't mentioned. It wasn't mentioned once. We weren't taught on it, we weren't trained in it. It was just, it might as well not exist, which was kind of the point at the time where trauma-informed started to be introduced, right? So I didn't get it there. Not trauma-informed, not trauma-trained. What also was missing in my Masters of Counselling and Psychotherapy is the actual trauma-informed training. So I didn't get that trauma-informed training there either. We did one subject on trauma, which would have meant a 101 on trauma. Principles, language, understanding, but still not the treatment of trauma, even in a master's degree. So therefore my credentials, the place that sort of makes me officially a therapist, didn't actually train me in any of these things. Not to be informed and not to be trauma trained. If so, scratching of the surface. So it was like the prequel for trauma informed training. So for me, everything that happened was outside of my qualification gathering, right? It wasn't in a retreat. It wasn't in a workplace. It wasn't in my degrees. It was through everything after that. So it started to happen through the ongoing training that I started to want to get involved in. So all of my focus, my niche, was trauma. So I started going and learning different trauma things. At workplaces, they would bring in trauma-informed trainings, and I would do more complex trainings that had to do with trauma. Then I started to be experiential in the way that I did a lot of my work. So I got a lot of it in the field, working with more and more people in their experiences. So that with my extracurriculum course that I would go out to seek where I could get trained in this, and my experiences in all the vast places that I've worked, that's what allowed for the trauma training, right? There isn't necessarily a specific trauma training degree. I've done extracurriculum and external, or I guess extra learning on somatic psychotherapy, which is about the body, so lots of trauma training in that. I've also done parts work, which is lots of trauma training in that. I've also done lots of different work in addiction treatment centers where we work specifically with trauma, and worked in really high-risk environments where children have been at risk of harm and have had experiences of trauma. And these are the places that I start to make sense of how to become more able to work with someone in the experience of their trauma. One example that separates trauma-informed and trauma-trained is that a trauma-informed individual that's done some training won't be able to meet someone in the complexity of domestic violence and historical abuse. That they experienced it when they were a kid, and now they keep finding themselves in those relationships as an adult. What they can do is gain a lot of awareness around what all that means for them. But then not, how do I treat that? This is the big difference. I'll give you another example. If I'm working with someone's deep shame and doubt around how they see themselves, the core belief of I'm not worthy, and then what that does to the system, I can be very informed and aware of that. But unless I've done training, I won't be able to sit with being able to go back, understand where it all came from, and then start to work with someone's trauma when it was happening, how it impacted on them, how it links to now, how they can make meaning. And the big kicker, where a lot of trauma work is, and what's underneath a lot of this work, is shame. So when we look at being trauma-informed, it does not go beyond. It does not go beyond creating awareness, which is actually where a lot of people get stuck, is that they've done a lot of insight. They've created a lot of awareness. So what's awesome is that someone that's ready for this part of their journey might get a lot of deep understanding and awareness around what's going on for them and what's happening to them. But when it comes to the treatment, what we're then going to do to hold them and work through and process some of that trauma, heal and treat what's going on. So if I rewind just a little bit, if you're someone who's listening to this going, holy shit, I need to do more trauma training. We all need to do more trauma training, because there's no way to be fully aware of and understand and be able to completely work with the human. We're complex, right? So I will always be continuing my learning. Where I am now after 10 years of experience, plus my 20 years before that of life experience that sort of helped qualify me for the work because of my own experiences of trauma, means that where I can now go with it all is endless. I'm just going to keep learning and keep upskilling on this stuff. So if you've only done some trauma-informed training, great, we can now start learning more and more and more. Something that was really sad in the work that I was doing in addiction treatment centers is this thing that was missed, was that we would turn away people that had an experience of trauma, despite our awareness of what's going on for their experience. So what that means, if we stay in our lane, where we're informed, I can hold space. I can be with someone who's had a bunch of trauma. I don't need to refer out every single person that I therefore see. What I need to be conscious of is what I can do with them. Which, if we look at, I guess, the way trauma work works, is phase one is all about safety and stability. If you are a therapist or a coach or a space holder that's done enough work on being able to help resource someone, being able to understand safety and what creates safety for an individual, being able to understand how we would stabilize someone and give them the support that they need to feel more safe. And this is phase one of trauma work. So anyone who's trauma informed can work really deeply with someone in their safety and stability. We don't need to do phase two, which is all about going back, right? Because they might not need that. They might not be ready for that. So we can do heaps of safety and stability work, getting people to a place where they feel more safe and stable. It doesn't mean that they'll move forwards and break through what's holding them back and they keep cycling in, which is where the deep work lives. But so much is possible in the safety and stability work. It's then when we take on too much and try to then start to treat, when we then try and start to do beyond the depths of what goes on underneath it, which is really trauma-focused work, right? Where we're really then applying what we learn around the trauma training and being able to implement that. But all trauma training and a lot of trauma-informed will support you with is being able to get an idea of someone has their complexity and their big experience and what that can look like, the principles of being able to create safety and trust and rapport, to be able to move in a way that works with them, and then actually really create a lot of stability for someone. The risk is when we go beyond that and think that trauma-informed therefore means I can work in the depths of their childhood trauma, where I can work in the depths of the relational, the developmental concerns that are going in their everyday life, to the complexity of their addiction that's folding and unfolding because of what has happened in their past. The level of shame and pain that might be dwelling and building within their system. That's where we want to steer clear from the lack of training and just the informed training. I can see, maybe I'm aware of it, but I can't help be with it in a way that feels safe. Now, any good trauma-informed training, which there is some, not a lot, will be training you to understand that to be trauma-informed means to be looking after myself, means to be having supervision or support or mentoring on the work that I'm doing. And it means to be able to be aware of what I need for me in order to show up and hold space for another nervous system and my own. That's missing in a lot of trainings, but something that's so important to really hear and let land, because then we're able to actually deepen with another person, because we will then get why this is such sacred work, right? A lot of coaches will say, I stay in my lane, I do what I can and not move them on, which I don't know if that's the case. I haven't seen it happen where many people are kind of saying, no, you're not appropriate with me because you're too complex, right? Here, there, and everywhere, right? But there's a big spectrum of complexity that people are missing, that I think they just want the client or they think that they can handle it. But when we look back and look at what trauma training they've done, they're really risking what's possible and what might happen. First and foremost, in any of these two things, trauma-informed or trauma-trained, we should be able to look at screening to be able to really get an idea of where someone's at before we take them through to something really kind of big. So, when we get into the deep work, the trauma-focused work, we go beyond being informed. What we want to start deeply be able to learn is something you can check off to see if you know how to hold this with somebody else. Or if your therapist at the moment isn't able to do that in a way that really feels like they are helping you with the treatment of what's going on for you. First and biggest one is shame. Shame has this ability to bind to all of our experiences and really screw up everything else. It has a power over us that means that we will be led by it a lot of the time. Do what it takes to be enough. Shame ourselves for not being better. Whatever it might be, shame is very powerful. So trauma training is a lot about shame, how to work with shame. From there, we're looking at different parts of ourselves. There's lots of different aspects of what makes up me, not just me as I am as my authentic, functional adult. There's little components and parts of me, which might be where some of this stuff, wounding, happened, where this shame originates, which means that my little boy had an impact, had something to go on over time. Maybe it's a home that wasn't super safe to build confidence in because it was critical or judgy or whatever it would be that would actually criticize the experience, right, of what it is to be a kid. So I've taken that on. How I move and live with that now is what is going on today. So being able to understand how and where some of this comes from is where we can then start to unpack it, right? So we can understand the part. The nervous system, being able to deeply understand the nervous system and how it operates and how some of our parts are operating within the nervous system, whether which part of me is really activated or hot and boiling versus freezing, shut down and dissociative. Being able to really recognize what's going on with the body and how to meet that in respect of where someone might need to be, whether we pause and be with them or whether we let them move some of that energy through. The somatic work of being with the body so that stuff can move around, the emotions, the trauma, whatever it is that's showing up in our tenseness, in our dropping, in our expression, in our energy. This is trauma-focused work. This is why it needs a lot of training. How to be and connect with someone, to meet them in that deep healing, does not come from simple trauma-informed care. So let this be a lesson to anybody that has done a trauma-informed training or has seen a therapist that they like who says it's trauma-informed. This is what it actually means, and this is what I think you hope it means, is that there's a deep ability to do the work versus there's an awareness of the trauma, right? What's possible? For me, what's possible is I get to take my training, my learning, and share it with as many people as I can, so that we have a bunch of different therapists who have reclaimed what's going on for themselves. So reduce their shame, step into their worth, and now lead from a place that's able to keep rippling down a beautiful legacy, so that then everyone can step more and more into who they truly are, their authentic self. That's what's possible for me. What also is possible for me is being able to continue to train and deepen my ability to understand how to work deeply with someone else's experience. I just ordered, before the end of financial year, sales, like 15 books, 2 hobbies, buying the books versus reading the books. I will get to these books eventually, but a lot of them are around the same sort of shit. Just deepening my understanding in all the different ways and lenses that it can be taught through trauma, relationships, self-worth. That's what's possible for me, to keep moving and adapting how much I can consume and then bring to when I treat people with trauma. What's possible for an individual that's started to see the difference between these two things is where they want to do their next bit of work. What is the next edge? Before they do more, is how can I look through a lens that is about what more can I get within me and train externally with what's possible, so that I can continue to go deeper in the way that I work with individuals. How do I go beyond being informed and step into focused work? What's possible is then those people feel that they're able to hold the complexity of what's going on for someone, the depths of someone's shame and pain, the ability to understand the behavior, the intricate behavior of someone's childhood abuse that happened 40 years ago and how it's showing up in their life now. The difference between the protective parts of themselves that keep showing up and getting in the way, avoiding everything at all costs so that they don't get more hurt, versus the authentic self who just wants to be them and thrive, versus the wounded part of us, so scared, vulnerable, and alone. This is what's possible for those that are really dedicated to continuing to learn and go beyond the ticker box certificate or the accreditation process of being an informed practitioner. If this is something that lands deeply for you and you want to do more than what you're very capable of doing, which is safety and stability work, then I love having a chat about this to deepen someone's experience and see where their gaps are and what their learning could and should be. If you're someone that wants to then tune in and question what's going on for my therapist and the work that I'm doing for yourself, I have a quiz to see who's leading and where you might be at and where your next edge might be. I also have an ability to come to one of my masterclasses that's on Before You Do More Work, where you can really get an idea of what's needed now before I do more. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'll see you on the next one.